A millionaire helps a poor black mother, only to find her the next day at his dead wife's grave. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments from where you watch this video. Michael Harrison was a name synonymous with success. In his 52 years, he had built an empire that stretched across industries, finance, technology, and real estate, securing his position as one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the country. His image, a sharp-dressed man with perfectly combed silver hair and a confident, composed demeanor, adorned countless business magazines. To the outside world, Michael epitomized the American dream, a man who seemingly had it all. His mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a testament to his accomplishments. The sprawling estate, surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens and hidden behind wrought iron gates, exuded wealth and power. Inside, marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with priceless art. Yet, for all its opulence, the mansion was eerily silent, its vast halls echoing with an emptiness that mirrored Michael's life. Despite his outward success, Michael lived a life of solitude. 10 years had passed since the death of his wife, Elizabeth, and in that time he had buried himself in work, building his fortune and avoiding the ache of her absence. Elizabeth had been more than his wife. She was his anchor, his moral compass, and the only person who truly understood him. Her death had left a void that no amount of wealth or accomplishment could fill. Elizabeth's passing had been sudden, a rare illness that took her life within weeks of diagnosis. Michael, a man used to controlling every aspect of his life, had been powerless to stop it. In the decades since, he had avoided confronting his grief, choosing instead to lose himself in the comfort of his structured routines and the relentless demands of his business empire. But there were moments when the pain broke through his carefully constructed defenses. Every Friday, without fail, Michael visited Elizabeth's grave. It was a quiet ritual that he kept secret from the world. He would bring a bouquet of white roses, her favorite, and place them gently on the polished headstone. For a few minutes he would stand in silence, his eyes tracing the engraved letters of her name, as he tried to summon her presence in the stillness of the cemetery. Those visits were the only times Michael allowed himself to feel vulnerable. In the quiet of the cemetery, surrounded by rows of gravestones and the whispers of the wind, he could let down the mask he wore for the world. He would think about the life they had shared, the plans they had made, and the dreams that had died with her. And he would wonder, as he often did, if she would have been proud of the man he had become. Elizabeth had been a woman of boundless compassion. She had spent her days volunteering at shelters and community centers, helping those who had been dealt a harder hand in life. Michael had admired her for it, but he had never fully understood it. He had always been a pragmatist, focused on results and efficiency. To him, Elizabeth's efforts seemed like drops in an ocean of need. But she had believed that even small acts of kindness could create ripples that would spread far and wide. Michael's thoughts often returned to those conversations during his visits to her grave. He would remember the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the people she had helped, the way she saw potential in everyone, no matter their circumstances. And he would feel a pang of guilt for not appreciating her work more when she was alive. The rest of Michael's life was a stark contrast to those quiet, reflective moments at the cemetery. His days were filled with meetings, negotiations, and decisions that affected the lives of thousands. He was respected, even feared in the business world, but his personal life was a different story. He had few close friends, and his relationships were transactional at best. The mansion that once echoed with laughter and music now stood as a cold monument to his isolation. Michael was aware of the irony of his situation. He had everything he had ever wanted: money, power, and influence, but none of it brought him the happiness he had known when Elizabeth was alive. He often thought about the moments they had shared, the quiet evenings on the porch, the long walks in the park, the way she would laugh at his dry sense of humor. Those memories were his only solace in a life that felt increasingly hollow. One Friday evening, as Michael prepared to leave for the cemetery, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked every bit the successful businessman, impeccably dressed, composed, and confident. But behind the polished exterior, he saw the cracks, the lines of fatigue etched into his face, the shadow of loneliness in his eyes. He adjusted his tie, picked up the bouquet of roses, and headed out the door. The drive to the cemetery was familiar, almost mechanical. As his car wound through the quiet streets of Greenwich, Michael found himself thinking about Elizabeth more than usual. He wondered what she would have said about his life now. Would she have encouraged him to find happiness again, to let someone else in? Or would she have understood his decision to keep his heart guarded, to focus on his work and avoid the pain of loss? When he arrived at the cemetery, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rows of gravestones. Michael made his way to Elizabeth's grave, the bouquet of roses in hand. As he approached, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the ache that always accompanied these visits. He placed the flowers on the headstone, his fingers brushing against the cool marble. For a moment, he stood in silence, letting the memories wash over him. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I miss you," he said, the words hanging in the air like a confession. "I don't know if I'll ever stop missing you." As the last rays of sunlight faded, Michael turned to leave, his heart heavy with the weight of his grief. But as he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, a sense that his carefully constructed world was on the brink of being disrupted. The rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the glass of Michael Harrison's car as he sat in traffic on a busy Manhattan street. The city was alive with movement despite the weather. Umbrellas bobbed through the crowds, headlights cut through the gloom, and the muffled cacophony of honking horns and rushing footsteps filled the air. Michael, cocooned in the silence of his sleek black sedan, barely registered the chaos outside. His mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with the endless demands of his business empire and the emptiness that awaited him at home. As the light turned green and the car inched forward, a movement on the sidewalk caught his attention. He turned his head just in time to see her, a woman standing on the corner, cradling a small child. She was soaked to the bone, her thin coat offering little protection against the cold rain. The child, bundled in a tattered blanket, nestled against her chest, oblivious to the harshness of the world around them. The woman's face was etched with exhaustion, her eyes scanning the crowd with quiet desperation. She wasn't shouting or begging, but the way she held the child, shielding it with her own body, spoke volumes. Michael's gaze lingered on her as his car rolled forward. It wasn't unusual to see people struggling on the streets of New York, and he had long since learned to tune it out. But something about this woman, a flicker of determination in her eyes, perhaps, or the way she clung to the child, made it impossible for him to look away. "Stop the car," he said abruptly, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the engine. The driver, a seasoned professional who had worked for Michael for years, glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing. "Sir?" "Just pull over," Michael repeated, already reaching for the door handle. The car slowed to a stop at the curb, and Michael stepped out, the cold rain immediately soaking through his overcoat. As he approached the woman, she turned her head, her eyes narrowing slightly in cautious recognition of his presence. Up close, Michael could see the toll life had taken on her, dark circles under her eyes, a hollowness in her cheeks, and hands that trembled slightly as she adjusted the blanket around the child. Despite her worn appearance, there was an undeniable dignity in the way she carried herself, as though she refused to let the world strip her of her pride. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice low but steady. He wasn't used to asking such questions. His interactions with people were usually transactional, rooted in power and control. But this felt different. The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering with a mixture of wariness and hope. Finally she nodded, her voice barely audible over the rain. "For my baby." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, withdrawing a thick wad of bills. He handed them to her without a second thought. "Use this to get food and find somewhere warm to stay," he said, his tone brisk but not unkind. The woman stared at the money in disbelief, her hands trembling as she took it. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." Michael nodded, already turning to leave, but her next words stopped him in his tracks. "People like you don't usually notice people like me," she said softly, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. When he turned back, she was looking at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as though she could see straight through him. For a moment, he considered saying something, perhaps offering more help or asking about her situation, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded again and returned to his car, the encounter replaying in his mind as they drove away. The rest of the drive was silent, save for the rhythmic thrum of rain against the windows. Michael stared out at the city, his thoughts tangled. He had done what he could, hadn't he? He had given her money, enough to get by for a while, but the image of her standing in the rain, clutching her child, lingered in his mind, stirring something he couldn't quite name. By the time he arrived home, the encounter had settled into his consciousness like a splinter, small but persistent. He tried to push it aside, burying himself in work and routine, but her face, the mix of desperation and strength in her eyes, remained with him. It was as though she had opened a door he hadn't realized was there, one that led to questions he wasn't ready to confront. Who was she? What had brought her to that street corner on such a miserable night? And why, after years of walking past countless people like her without a second glance, had he stopped for her? These thoughts swirled in his mind as he sat in his study, the rain still tapping against the windows. He didn't have answers, and that unsettled him. As the night wore on, Michael found himself looking out into the darkness, his heart heavier than it had been in a long time. For all his wealth and power, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing. A connection, perhaps, or a sense of purpose beyond the relentless pursuit of success. And for the first time in years, he wondered if it was too late to find it. Friday came, and with it the familiar ritual. Michael Harrison rose early, as he always did on this day, his morning routine meticulous. He dressed in a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and retrieved a fresh bouquet of white roses from the kitchen. These were Elizabeth's favorite, and he never brought anything else. The drive to the cemetery was as predictable as the rest of his week. The luxury of his car's interior contrasted starkly with the somber purpose of his journey. Michael barely registered the passing scenery. His thoughts, as always on Fridays, were with Elizabeth. Her laughter, her kind eyes, the warmth of her hand in his, These memories, though painful, were the only moments of true connection he allowed himself to feel anymore. When he arrived at the cemetery, the sun was struggling to break through a veil of clouds, casting a muted light over the rows of gravestones. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of damp earth. Michael stepped out of the car, clutching the bouquet of roses, and made his way down the familiar path toward Elizabeth's resting place. As he approached the grave, something unusual caught his eye. A figure, huddled and still, was kneeling by the headstone. At first, he thought it might be a groundskeeper or perhaps someone who had simply wandered into the wrong section. But as he drew closer, recognition hit him like a bolt of lightning. It was her, the woman from the street corner. She was still holding her baby, who now slept peacefully against her chest, wrapped in the same tattered blanket. Her head was bowed, and she seemed to be murmuring something, her voice so quiet that it was almost lost in the rustle of the wind. Michael froze for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. What was she doing here? How could she possibly know Elizabeth? The questions flooded his mind, each one more urgent than the last. He quickened his pace, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, until he was standing just a few feet away from her. The woman looked up, startled by his presence. For a moment, their eyes met, and Michael saw a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. She began to rise, clutching the baby tighter, as though preparing to leave. "Wait," Michael said, his voice firmer than he intended. "What are you doing here?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the headstone and then back to him. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. I needed to be here." Michael's gaze shifted to the headstone, the elegant script of Elizabeth's name standing out against the polished marble. He couldn't fathom the connection. "How do you know my wife?" he asked, his tone edged with disbelief. The woman looked away, her grip on the baby tightening. "She helped me," she said after a long pause. "A long time ago, when I had nowhere else to go." Michael's mind reeled. Elizabeth had never mentioned this woman, or anyone like her, in all the years they had been married. "Helped you how?" he pressed, his voice sharp with confusion. The woman took a shaky breath. "I was living in a shelter," she said. "Pregnant, alone, and scared. Your wife, she came there to volunteer. She was kind to me when no one else was. She listened, she cared. She gave me hope." Michael stared at her, struggling to reconcile this revelation with the image of Elizabeth he had carried all these years. He knew she had been compassionate. Her charity work had always been a point of pride for her, but he had never truly understood the depth of her involvement. He had dismissed it as a hobby, something to fill her time while he focused on building their future. "She never told me," he said, more to himself than to the woman. "She wouldn't have," the woman replied quietly. "She wasn't the type to talk about the things she did. She just did them." Michael felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden. How many other lives had Elizabeth touched without him knowing? And why had he never taken the time to ask? Before he could form another question, the woman shifted, as though preparing to leave. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I just wanted to say thank you. To her." She began to walk away, but Michael called after her. "Wait." She stopped, turning back to face him. The baby stirred in her arms, but didn't wake. "What's your name?" he asked. "Leah," she said, "Leah Moore." Michael nodded slowly, the name unfamiliar yet heavy with significance. "And the baby?" "His name is Jordan." For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken questions. Michael wanted to know more, to understand the full story of how his wife had become a part of this woman's life. But Leah's expression made it clear that she wasn't ready to share more, at least not yet. "Take care of yourself," he said finally, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Leah nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said again, and this time her voice carried an undercurrent of something deeper, gratitude perhaps, or relief. Michael watched as she walked away, her figure growing smaller until she disappeared beyond the cemetery gates. When she was gone, he turned back to Elizabeth's grave, the bouquet of roses still in his hand. He placed them gently on the headstone, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to answer. For the first time in years, he felt as though Elizabeth was speaking to him, not in words, but in the legacy she had left behind. And for the first time, he realized that her kindness, her unwavering belief in the goodness of people, might have been the greatest wealth she had ever possessed. As he stood there, the wind picking up around him, Michael felt a strange mix of emotions: grief, guilt, and something else he couldn't quite name. A sense that his carefully constructed world was beginning to crack, and that what lay beneath was something far more profound than he had ever imagined. The encounter at the cemetery left Michael restless. That evening, he paced the halls of his grand estate, the silence weighing heavier than usual. Leah Moore. The name echoed in his mind, tethered to the memories of Elizabeth. Who was this woman, and why had she never come up in the countless conversations he and Elizabeth had shared? What had driven Leah to seek solace at her grave? Unable to ignore the questions gnawing at him, Michael resolved to learn more. He had resources at his disposal: private investigators, connections to every major institution in the city. But something about Leah's demeanor at the cemetery stopped him from taking the impersonal route. This was personal, and he owed it to Elizabeth to approach it as such. The next day, Michael left his office earlier than usual. His assistant, who was accustomed to his strict schedule, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Michael had asked one of his staff members to discreetly track Leah down after she left the cemetery. He now knew where she was staying, a rundown shelter on the city's west side. The shelter stood in stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers and luxury apartments Michael frequented. Its chipped paint and sagging roof told a story of neglect, but the inside buzzed with quiet activity. Volunteers moved between rows of cots, offering meals and blankets to those in need. The air smelled of disinfectant and faintly of hope, a fragile, fleeting kind. Michael found Leah sitting at a corner table, cradling her baby. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from surprise to guardedness. He gestured to the empty seat across from her, and after a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "I didn't expect to see you again," Leah said quietly, her voice steady but cautious. Michael folded his hands on the table. "I wanted to talk about Elizabeth." Leah's gaze softened at the mention of his wife's name. She adjusted the blanket around her baby and nodded. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Michael said. "How you met her, how she helped you, why you came to her grave." Leah took a deep breath, her eyes drifting to the baby in her arms as though drawing strength from him. "I was 19 when I met her," she began. "I'd just moved to the city, trying to escape a life that didn't have much to offer." Michael leaned forward slightly, sensing the weight behind her words. "I grew up in Atlanta," Leah continued. "My mom died when I was 12. Cancer. It took everything we had, and when she was gone, there was nothing left. My dad, He didn't stick around for long. I think losing her broke him in a way he couldn't come back from. After that, it was just me." She paused as if reliving the years that followed. "I did what I could to survive, took whatever jobs I could find, stayed with friends, couch surfed, but it was always temporary. When I was 18, I thought, maybe if I get out of this place, I can start over. So I saved up what little I had and came here." Michael listened intently, his mind conjuring an image of a young Leah, alone and determined, stepping into the city with nothing but hope and resilience. "It didn't go the way I planned," Leah said with a rueful smile. "The jobs I thought I'd find weren't there. The city was colder than I imagined, in every sense of the word. And then," her voice faltered, "I found out I was pregnant." Michael's brow furrowed. He could sense where this was going, but waited for her to continue. "The father, he didn't stick around," Leah said bitterly. "I was terrified. I didn't have a place to live, no family to call. The shelters I went to were overcrowded, and most of them didn't have space for someone like me. That's when I met Elizabeth." Michael's breath caught at the mention of her name. "She was volunteering at one of the shelters," Leah said, her tone softening. "I'll never forget the first time I saw her. She had this warmth about her, like she genuinely cared. She wasn't there to judge or preach, she just wanted to help." "What did she do?" Michael asked, his voice quieter now. "She listened," Leah said simply. "No one else had, not really. I told her everything, about my mom, my dad, how scared I was for my baby, and she didn't just nod and say, 'I'm sorry.' She actually listened. She helped me find a safe place to stay, gave me advice on how to navigate the system, even connected me with someone who could help me find work after the baby was born." Michael sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. He had always known Elizabeth was compassionate, but hearing Leah's story gave him a new perspective on just how far that compassion had extended. "But then, one day, she stopped coming," Leah said, her voice tinged with sadness. "I didn't know why. I asked the staff at the shelter, but they didn't have answers. It wasn't until later that I found out she had passed away." Her words hit Michael like a blow. Elizabeth had been helping others right up until the end, quietly and selflessly, without expecting recognition or praise. "I didn't know what to do when I heard," Leah continued, her voice trembling. "I wanted to thank her, to tell her how much she meant to me, but it was too late." She looked up at Michael, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's why I went to her grave. I needed to say thank you. To let her know that even though she's gone, what she did for me, it mattered." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. For so long, he had thought of Elizabeth's charity work as a side project, something she did to pass the time while he focused on building their future. But Leah's story shattered that illusion. Elizabeth's work had been her way of changing the world, one life at a time. "Leah," he said after a long pause, "I didn't know she was doing any of this. She never told me." "She wouldn't have," Leah said with a small smile. "That wasn't who she was." Michael nodded, his chest tightening with a mixture of pride and regret. "Thank you for telling me," he said, "and for keeping her memory alive." Leah nodded, her expression softening. "She was an incredible woman," she said, "and I'll never forget what she did for me." As Michael left the shelter, his mind was awhirl with thoughts. Elizabeth's legacy was larger than he had ever realized, and for the first time, he felt an obligation to honor it, not just with words, but with action. Michael Harrison sat in his study, the room illuminated by the soft glow of a single desk lamp. The heavy silence of his mansion pressed against him as he opened the wooden box he had retrieved from the back of a closet. It was an unassuming box, small and worn, but it contained some of the most personal remnants of Elizabeth's life. Letters, photographs, and documents lay inside, their edges softened by time. He had not opened this box in years. It had been too painful. Elizabeth had kept it close to her, using it to store mementos and notes from her charitable work, a world that Michael had only ever seen from the periphery. Now, with Leah's story fresh in his mind, he felt compelled to dig deeper, to uncover the parts of Elizabeth's life he had never fully appreciated. The first thing he pulled out was a small stack of photographs. In one, Elizabeth stood in a crowded shelter, her arm around a young girl with hopeful eyes. The girl couldn't have been more than 14. Behind them were rows of folding chairs and tables stacked with donated clothes and food. Michael turned the photo over and saw Elizabeth's elegant handwriting. L. Moore, 14. Atlanta Shelter, 2007. His breath caught. It was Leah, a younger version, yes, but unmistakably her. The quiet determination in her eyes had not faded with time. Michael stared at the photograph, a pang of guilt tightening his chest. How had he not known about this? Next, he found a bundle of letters neatly tied with a ribbon. Most were thank you notes from people Elizabeth had helped, their words brimming with gratitude. One letter, however, stood out. It was from Elizabeth herself, dated just a few months before her passing. Michael unfolded it carefully, the delicate paper crinkling under his fingers. "Dear Michael," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here, and there are things I need you to know. Over the years, I've met so many people who are struggling, people who are ignored by the world simply because they don't fit its idea of success. I've tried to help them in whatever small ways I could, but it's not enough. The truth is, we have the resources to do more, Michael. You have the power to do more. I hope one day you'll see the world the way I do, not just as a series of problems to solve, but as a tapestry of lives, each one worth saving." Michael's hands trembled as he set the letter down. Her words were a plea, not just for the people she had helped, but for him, to step out of his self-imposed isolation and truly engage with the world. He continued digging through the box, uncovering more pieces of Elizabeth's hidden legacy. A notebook filled with her handwritten plans for a community center, receipts for donations made anonymously to various shelters, lists of names, some with notes beside them. Job interview next week. Got an apartment. Each detail painted a picture of a woman who had devoted herself to lifting others up, quietly and without fanfare. Finally, at the bottom of the box, he found a small envelope with his name on it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a candid shot of Elizabeth sitting on a park bench, surrounded by a group of young women, each of them smiling. Leah was among them, holding a small paper cup and laughing at something Elizabeth had said. On the back, Elizabeth had written, "Each life we touch is a thread in the fabric of something greater." Michael leaned back in his chair, the photograph still in his hand. For years, he had believed that his work, building companies, creating wealth, was his way of contributing to the world. But now, he realized how small that contribution seemed in comparison to the lives Elizabeth had changed. She had built something far more enduring, a legacy of compassion and connection. The next morning, Michael took the box to his office and spread its contents across the large mahogany desk. His assistant knocked lightly on the door, poking her head in. "Mr. Harrison?" "Your 9 o'clock is here," she said. "Cancel it," Michael replied without looking up. The assistant hesitated. "Sir?" "Cancel the rest of the day. Reschedule everything." His tone left no room for argument. As the door closed, Michael picked up the notebook Elizabeth had filled with her plans for the community center. It was detailed, with sketches of classrooms, notes on potential staff, and a list of services she wanted to offer: childcare, job training, mental health support. It was ambitious, but it was also unfinished. Michael knew what he had to do. He called a meeting with his legal and financial advisors that same afternoon. Sitting at the head of a long conference table, he presented his vision with a clarity and determination that left no room for doubt. "We're establishing a foundation," he announced. "The Elizabeth Harrison Foundation. Its mission will be to provide support for women and children facing homelessness, poverty, and systemic injustice." The advisors exchanged glances, clearly surprised by this sudden shift in priorities. One of them, a graying man with a reputation for pragmatism, leaned forward. "Mr. Harrison, this is a noble idea, but it will require significant resources to get off the ground." Michael fixed him with a steady gaze. "I have significant resources," he said simply. "It's time I use them for something that matters." As the meeting progressed, Michael outlined his plan in detail, drawing heavily from Elizabeth's notes. The foundation would fund shelters, education programs, and healthcare initiatives. It would prioritize partnerships with existing organizations to maximize its impact. And it would begin with a single pilot project, completing the community center Elizabeth had envisioned. When the meeting adjourned, Michael returned to his office, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, he felt connected to her in a meaningful way, as though he were carrying forward the work she had started. That evening, he called Leah. Her voice was wary when she answered, but she agreed to meet him the next day. Michael knew that her involvement would be crucial. Not only was she a direct beneficiary of Elizabeth's kindness, but she also understood the struggles faced by the people the foundation aimed to help. As he ended the call, Michael glanced at the photograph of Elizabeth and Leah on the park bench. He set it on his desk, where it would remain as a reminder of the woman who had taught him that true wealth was measured not in dollars, but in the lives we touch. Michael sat across from Leah in a quiet corner of a modest cafe. The atmosphere was warm, with the hum of low conversations and the faint clatter of dishes in the background. Leah had agreed to meet him but arrived with visible hesitation. Her shoulders were tense, her grip on the baby carrier firm, as though preparing herself for a fight. Michael, accustomed to commanding boardrooms with his presence, felt uncharacteristically unsure of himself. He had spent the past few days poring over Elizabeth's letters, photographs, and notes, trying to understand how best to honor her legacy. And now, sitting face to face with Leah, he realized that his ideas meant nothing without her perspective. "Thank you for coming," Michael began, his tone quieter than usual. "I know this might feel strange, but I wanted to talk to you about something important." Leah nodded, her expression cautious but curious. "What is it?" Michael leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "Elizabeth helped you during one of the hardest times in your life. She believed in you, even when the world didn't. And she did that for so many people. I want to continue her work, to create something that helps others the way she helped you." Leah's eyes softened at the mention of Elizabeth's name. "How?" she asked. "What are you planning to do?" Michael reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. sketches, notes, and a detailed outline of his plan for the Elizabeth Harrison Foundation. He slid them across the table to Leah. "This," he said, "a foundation in her name. It will focus on helping women and children who are struggling, whether it's with homelessness, poverty, or access to education and health care. I want to start by completing the community center she dreamed of. But I don't want to do this alone. I need people who understand what it means to live through those struggles. People like you." Leah stared at the papers for a long moment before picking them up. She flipped through them slowly, her expression shifting between surprise, skepticism, and something that looked like hope. "Why me?" she asked finally, setting the papers down. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Michael replied. "I know you've lived through things I can't imagine. And I know you have the strength and insight to help others in ways I never could. This isn't just about creating programs, it's about making them work for the people who need them most." Leah leaned back in her chair, her arms folding across her chest. "This sounds good," she said carefully. "But I've seen people make promises like this before. They show up, say they want to help, and then disappear when it gets hard. How do I know this isn't just another one of those?" Michael's jaw tightened. He understood her doubt. It was earned through years of being let down by a world that seemed determined to overlook her. "I can't change the past," he said, meeting her gaze directly. "But I can promise you this. I'm not here to walk away. This foundation isn't about me. It's about Elizabeth and the lives she wanted to change. And if you give me a chance, I'll prove that to you." Leah studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, "I'll help, but only because I believe in what Elizabeth stood for." Michael felt a wave of relief, though he kept it contained. "Thank you," he said. "This will only work if we do it together." Over the next few weeks, Michael and Leah worked side by side to lay the groundwork for the foundation. Their collaboration was not without challenges. Leah's initial distrust of Michael's motives sometimes led to tense moments, and Michael, unaccustomed to being questioned, had to learn to listen rather than lead. But as they spent more time together, a mutual respect began to grow. Leah brought invaluable insights to the table. She knew firsthand the barriers faced by women in shelters, how difficult it was to find affordable childcare, how impossible it felt to secure a job without a stable address, and how systemic biases made it even harder for Black women like her to break free from poverty. Michael, for his part, used his resources and connections to turn Leah's insights into actionable plans. He secured funding, recruited experts to develop programs, and negotiated partnerships with local organizations. Slowly but surely, the foundation began to take shape. One of their first major breakthroughs came when Leah suggested a mentorship program, pairing women in need with those who had successfully transitioned out of similar situations. "Sometimes what you need most isn't just money or shelter," Leah explained during one of their planning sessions. "You need someone who's been where you are, someone who can show you that it's possible to make it." Michael immediately saw the value in the idea. He reached out to Elizabeth's old network of volunteers, many of whom were eager to get involved. Within weeks, the mentorship program was up and running, with Leah personally recruiting several mentors from her own community. As the foundation grew, Michael began to notice a change in himself. The work, though demanding, felt deeply fulfilling. For the first time in years, he felt connected to something larger than himself, something that gave meaning to his wealth and influence. And as he watched Leah thrive in her new role, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in the foundation, but in her. Leah, too, was changing. The guardedness that had defined her in their early meetings began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence. She threw herself into the work, balancing her responsibilities at the foundation with caring for her son, Jordan. Michael often found her in the office late at night, her baby sleeping in a makeshift crib beside her desk as she reviewed program proposals or coordinated with volunteers. One evening, as they wrapped up a long day of meetings, Leah turned to Michael with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "Elizabeth used to say that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples. I didn't believe her at first, but now I think she was right." Michael smiled, a rare, genuine warmth in his expression. "She had a way of seeing things the rest of us couldn't," he said. "I just wish I'd understood that sooner." Leah placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm but gentle. "You're honoring her now," she said, "and because of that, her legacy will live on." As Michael left the office that night, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, he wasn't just surviving, he was building something that mattered. And he knew, deep in his heart, that she would be proud. The official launch of the Elizabeth Harrison Foundation was a spectacle unlike anything Michael had envisioned. Held in a grand hall in Manhattan, the event was equal parts celebration and call to action. Influential figures from across industries gathered under glittering chandeliers, mingling as soft jazz played in the background. It was the kind of event that Michael had attended countless times in his career, but this one felt different. This wasn't about business deals or personal accolades. This was about Elizabeth, her legacy, her vision, and the lives she had touched. It was about something far more significant than profit margins or quarterly reports. And as Michael stood near the entrance, greeting guests, he couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness. This was new territory for him. For once, he wasn't the center of attention. The foundation was. Leah arrived halfway through the evening, carrying herself with a quiet grace that stood out amidst the glitz of the room. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, and her son Jordan was safely in the care of a volunteer at one of the Foundation's partner organizations. Leah had been hesitant to attend, worried she wouldn't fit in among the wealthy and powerful attendees, but Michael had insisted. "You're not just part of this, Leah," he had told her the day before. "You're one of the reasons it exists." As she entered the room, several guests turned to look at her, their curiosity evident. Leah felt their eyes on her, but she lifted her chin and walked toward Michael, who greeted her with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came," he said, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "This wouldn't have been the same without you." Leah nodded, scanning the room. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted. "I've never been to anything like this." Michael followed her gaze. "Neither have most of the people we're here to help," he said quietly. "That's why tonight is so important. This is just the beginning." As the evening progressed, Michael made his way to the stage. The room quieted as he approached the microphone, his presence commanding but not imposing. He took a moment to look out at the crowd before speaking. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady. "Many of you know me as a businessman, someone who has spent most of his life building companies and creating wealth. But tonight, I stand here not as a CEO, but as a husband, honoring the woman who changed my life." He paused, his eyes drifting to a large photograph of Elizabeth displayed on the stage behind him. She was smiling in the picture, her warmth radiating even through the still image. Elizabeth believed in the power of kindness, Michael continued. She believed that even the smallest acts could create ripples that would one day grow into waves of change. She dedicated her life to helping those who were struggling, not because she had to, but because she believed it was the right thing to do. He took a deep breath, his voice softening. For years, I didn't fully understand her work. I was too focused on my own pursuits to see the impact she was making. But now, thanks to the stories of people like Leah Moore, I understand. And I want to do everything I can to continue what she started. Michael gestured toward Leah, who stood near the front of the room, her eyes wide with surprise. Leah is a testament to Elizabeth's legacy. She's a survivor, a fighter, and now a leader in her own right. Her journey reminds us why this foundation is so important. The audience erupted into applause, and Leah looked down, her cheeks flushing. She hadn't expected to be singled out, and the attention felt overwhelming, but she also felt a sense of pride she hadn't known in years. Michael waited for the applause to die down before continuing. The Elizabeth Harrison Foundation will focus on providing support for women and children who face the kinds of challenges Elizabeth dedicated her life to addressing. From shelters to mentorship programs to job training, we will be there to offer a hand up, not just a handout. He ended his speech with a simple statement. This is not just about honoring the past. It's about building a future where no one is invisible, where every life is valued, and where hope is more than just a word. Thank you for joining us on this journey. The room erupted into applause once more as Michael stepped off the stage. He was immediately met by well-wishers, each eager to offer their support. But his eyes searched for Leah, who stood quietly near the edge of the crowd. He made his way to her, and she looked up as he approached. "You didn't have to say all that," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Yes, I did," Michael replied. "You deserve to be recognized, Leah. You're part of this, whether you like it or not." She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "Thank you," she said, "not just for tonight, but for everything." The event continued late into the night, with guests mingling, making pledges, and sharing ideas for the Foundation's initiatives. Michael watched from the sidelines, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. By the end of the evening, the Foundation had secured enough funding to launch its first major project, the completion of the community center Elizabeth had dreamed of. Leah, too, had found her place, not just as a beneficiary of the Foundation's work, but as a key figure in its future. As Michael stood by the large photograph of Elizabeth, a glass of champagne in hand, he felt a profound sense of connection, not just to her, but to the mission she had inspired. This was her legacy, but it was also his. Together, they had begun something that had the power to change lives. And for the first time since her passing, Michael felt at peace. The morning after the Foundation's launch, Michael woke with a sense of clarity that he hadn't felt in years. The previous evening had been a triumph, not because of the attention or accolades, but because it had brought Elizabeth's vision to life. For the first time since her passing, Michael felt as though he was walking a path she would have been proud of, but the work was only beginning. Michael arrived at the Foundation's temporary office early, a small but bustling space in a midtown building. The energy was palpable as staff members, many of them volunteers inspired by Elizabeth's story, worked to coordinate the Foundation's first projects. Leah was already there, seated at her desk with Jordan cooing softly in a portable crib beside her. She was reviewing a stack of program proposals, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You've been busy," Michael said as he approached her desk. Leah looked up and offered a small smile. "There's a lot to do. If we want the community center ready by the end of the year, we need to move fast." Michael nodded. "How are you feeling after last night?" "Tired," she admitted, glancing at the baby, "but in a good way. I didn't think I'd ever be part of something like this." "You're not just part of it," Michael said. "You're helping shape it." Leah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You know, there was a time when I thought people like you didn't see people like me at all. But this, what we're building, it's proof that change is possible." Her words stayed with Michael throughout the day as he met with donors, reviewed plans for the community center, and finalized details for the Foundation's mentorship program. Each step felt like a small piece of Elizabeth's legacy being restored, and with every decision, Michael felt himself growing more connected to the mission. The community center project quickly became the Foundation's centerpiece. Located in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods, it would offer a range of services: childcare, job training, legal aid, and mental health support. Leah had suggested including a kitchen for cooking classes and free meals, a place where families could come together and feel a sense of dignity and community. Michael had readily agreed. Leah threw herself into the project, working closely with architects, contractors, and local organizations to ensure the center met the needs of the community. Her dedication inspired the entire team, and even Michael found himself relying on her insight more than he had anticipated. Her ability to connect with people and understand their struggles was something he could never replicate, and he began to see her as not just a collaborator, but as a leader in her own right. As the months passed, the Foundation expanded its reach. The mentorship program, one of Leah's original ideas, paired women like her, who had overcome significant challenges, with those still in the midst of their struggles. The program quickly gained traction, with dozens of women signing up to become mentors. Each success story became a testament to Elizabeth's belief in the power of connection. One day, Michael and Leah visited the construction site of the community center together. The building was taking shape, its walls freshly painted and its rooms beginning to resemble the sketches Elizabeth had drawn years ago. As they walked through the space, Michael couldn't help but imagine what Elizabeth would have thought if she could see it. "This is incredible," Leah said, running her fingers along the edge of a countertop in what would soon be the center's main kitchen. "It's going to change lives." "It already has," Michael replied. He turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "And so have you." Leah looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief in her eyes. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." "No," Michael said firmly. "You're doing more than that. You're proving that hope isn't just a word. It's something real, something tangible. You're showing people that change is possible, just like Elizabeth did." Leah smiled, her gaze drifting to the unfinished room. "She believed in me when no one else did. I'll never forget that." "And now you're doing the same for others," Michael said. "That's her legacy." The grand opening of the community center marked a turning point for both Michael and Leah. Hundreds of people gathered to celebrate, including many who had been directly impacted by the Foundation's work. As Michael stood on the stage, addressing the crowd, he felt a sense of fulfillment that he had never experienced in all his years of business success. "This center is more than just a building," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's a place where lives will be rebuilt, where futures will be created, and where every person who walks through these doors will know that they matter. This is what Elizabeth believed in, and this is what we will continue to fight for. Leah joined him on stage, holding Jordan in her arms. The crowd erupted into applause as she stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke. This place is proof that no matter how hard life gets, there's always a way forward. Elizabeth saw that in me when I couldn't see it in myself. And now, because of her, I can stand here and say that hope is real. As the ceremony concluded and the center officially opened its doors, Michael watched as families began to explore the space. Children laughed as they ran through the hallways, parents spoke with staff members about the programs being offered, and volunteers greeted newcomers with warmth and kindness. It was everything Elizabeth had dreamed of, and more. Later that evening, as Michael and Leah stood outside the center, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Michael turned to her. "You've come a long way, Leah." "So have you," she replied, her voice soft. Michael smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected to Elizabeth's memory, to the work they were doing, and to the people whose lives were being changed. This wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about building a future full of possibility and hope. As the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, Michael knew one thing for certain. Elizabeth's legacy was alive and thriving, not just in the foundation, but in the lives of everyone it touched. And in that moment, he felt her presence more strongly than ever, as though she were standing beside him, guiding him forward. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with more stories like this. Check out our other videos for more inspiring content, and if you enjoyed this, share it with your friends to spread the message.